on Zoom, and we also have a few people from Activista monitoring the comment section on our live stream. All right, so we are live on Facebook on our pages. We will be waiting for the link na lalagay nila sa description box, sa chat box natin. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to formally welcome you all to Huwag Matakot, an Aswang post-screening forum. This online event is organized by Activista, Dakila Philippines, We the Future PH, Akbayan Youth, Center for Youth Advocacy and Networking, and Youth Resist. The same team also helped facilitate the online screening of the documentary Aswang by Alex Ain Arumpak. Aswang follows the first 2 years of Duterte's war against drugs, bringing forth stories of victims in marginalized communities and exposing a culture of impunity among our law enforcers. Despite our limited screening hours, the event's success manifested into important conversations and productive discussions that followed its online distribution. With the pervasive culture of violence, this film is a glaring reminder of the state of the nation ever since Duterte came into power. With the Filipino youth and children as one of the most vulnerable in times of violence and injustice, we hope that this post-screening discussion can ignite and unite the actions of the youth sector leading up to Duterte's State of the Nation address on the 27th. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our moderator for this afternoon's discussion. Shara Zambrano is a correspondent of ABS-CBN News and Current Affairs. Her body of work in recent years has focused on war and conflict and the local community's clamor for justice and peace. She followed the rise of the Islamist militant groups whose cause eventually led to the infamous Marawi siege. She has also extensively covered the West Philippine Sea and the injustices that take place away from our lives on the mainland. Shara has worked in the news for years, but began her storytelling life in documentaries, to which her heart still belongs. She has stayed in areas to create television documentaries where the brevity of news fails to capture the full picture, such as Di Ka Pa CCL in Marawi and Spratlys in the West Philippine Sea. Shara believes in the need to be there and witness the truth or the lie, and she believes in the immense power of the documentary to shine a strong beam of light where it is darkest. Hi po, Ms. Shara. Thank you so much for giving us your time today. So let me just quickly move on na lang to introducing our other panelists so we can get the introductions out of the way. All right, so we have the director herself of the documentary. We have director Alex Ain Arumpak. She studied film at the University of the Philippines and the Doc Nomads Erasmus Mundus Joint Master in Lisbon, Budapest, and Brussels, and was a scholar for creative writing at the Philippine High School for the Arts. Aswang, her first feature, is the first Filipino documentary to receive the Edu Cinema du Monde and is supported by the IDFA Bertha Fund, Sundance, Berlinale World Cinema Fund, and more. She produces short docs for television in Manila. We also have Dr. Nicole Curato. She is an associate professor at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra in Australia. Her academic work focuses on deliberative democracy as well as on populism in the Philippines. She is also a much sought after commentator on politics in the Philippines. Last year, she published the book Democracy in the Time of Misery: From Spectacular Tragedies to Deliberative Action with Oxford University Press. We also have Commissioner Karen Gomez Dompit. She has served the Philippine government for the past 30 years, with 27 years spent with the Commission on Human Rights. 25 of these years with the CHR, she devoted to human rights advocacy, serving as the first director of the CHR's Child Rights Center. Before her appointment as commissioner, she served as the director of Government Linkages Office, or now known as the Policy Advisory Office. Last but not the least, we have Alfonso Manalastas. He is an op-ed contributing writer, a spoken word artist, and a poet who was accepted as a poetry fellow for 2 national writers' workshops. His op-ed articles have appeared in ANCX, Inquirer, Rappler, and Scout, while his poems can be found in Likhaan, the Journal of Contemporary Philippine Literature published by UP Press, Chat, an Asian literary journal, Cordial Poetry Review, and the Quarterly Literary Review Singapore, among others. So, let us begin this discussion formally, and let me hand over the floor to our moderator, Ms. Shara Zambrano. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Hello, thank you everyone. Nakakatuwa na ang dami nating nandito ngayon to have this conversation. I hope I can get to your questions or comments in a while, but yeah, this is a very important conversation to have in this very overcast afternoon in the Philippines. Siyempre, yung assumption is lahat tayo napanood na natin yung Aswang, ano? So, gusto kong magsimula, siyempre, sa isang pasasalamat kay Alex. Sa lahat naman ng gumagawa ng documentaries. That's always the first thing that I say. Thank you, because I know how hard it is to keep pushing to tell a story. It's never easy, and it's siguro para kang nanganak yung feeling, di ba, pagka natatapos mo ang isang obra. So salamat Alex for sticking by this. Ang napansin ko doon sa gawa mo is yung restraint in the shots that you took, and even in your choice of characters. Si Jo Marie ay hindi siya ang bida talaga sa pangyayari. Wala siyang kamag-anak na namatay. Kaibigan lang niya by his account si Kian, 'di ba? Explain to me this restraint. Sa filming mo pa lang ba, sinabi mo na sa sarili mo na hindi ako lalapit masyado, hindi ko kukunan yung what is expected of this kind of story? O sa editing na lang lumabas yun, yung pag-atras?
Hi everyone, salamat sa pagpunta. Yeah, I like that word, restraint. Of course, while we're there, we film everything, we document everything kasi you're afraid to miss things rin. Pero early on, I recognized that it was important not to show very violent images or too much, precisely because I had a goal or an audience in mind. And I thought that if it was something too in your face, then this audience might close up and might refuse to take to open themselves to what I want to show. At the same time, yun nga, actually yung first idea ko was not to show the bodies at all, because meron din akong personal parang my questions din ako for myself, is this right to be showing such things, kasi syempre napaka-intimate din eh. Pero ultimately that's the story. Sa editing we decided, okay, maybe we really need to, and finally logistics din, security, safety rin. We made this film knowing na we have to receive the consequences because we live in the Philippines. Tapos yung mga tao rin nasa pelikula, if we put, like yung mga matitinding exposés, madedelikado rin yung mga tao. So we tried doing it this way.
Si Jo Marie, bakit si Jo Marie? Di ba, syempre yung instinct mo pag nandun ka, kunan mo yung nanay, yung tatay, yung lolo, kapatid, nung namatay. Kasi nasa kanila yung story. But why Jo Marie?
The people that I finally ended up with sa film, these were people that I was really drawn to, that I liked. Hindi sila necessarily my symbol, or hindi sila necessarily kasi they fit a certain profile for me na mahalaga. I just liked them. I enjoyed spending time. And with docs, you have to spend a lot of time with these people. So if you don't like someone, it's really hard. So that was actually the primary idea that informed my choice of characters.
Parang meron kang, tawag ko doon yung lukso ng dugo.
Oh, ano pala.
Diba?
Walang pumapansin sa kanya dun sa kasi the scene that was there, yung wake ni Kian, ginugulo niya lang si Ezra, the photographer, ginugulo niya lang yung camera. And then Ezra was telling me, ang kulit ng batang to. And so, biglang he was just saying a lot of things. And then I got interested. And then I started talking to him. And that was, binalik-balikan ko na.
Yung, when people talk about your film, they describe it as the first documentary about the drug war made by a Filipino. Gusto kong pag-usapan yun kasi syempre, yung as a journalist, storyteller, I can't help but feel guilt over just not telling the story enough. Did you feel that you were alone when you were telling this story? I've spoken to some of the night crawlers who have this frustration na ang dami-dami natin nung umpisa, bakit kayo umalis? Syempre there are a lot of answers and maraming pag-uusap dyan. Pero ikaw ba, naramdaman mo yun? Na tumitingin ka ba sa paligid mo na, nasa na yung mga kasama ko? Bakit nawala?
In the first couple of years, I think function na rin ang safety. It was, we all worked as a group. Pero actually itong tinatawag ng night crawlers, it became a community, like some sort of a collective. And for me personally, it helps. This group, we talk about whatever we see. We talk about, it helps me process things. So if you're asking me if I really felt alone, yeah, maybe. I mean, the process of making a film really makes you feel alone. Pero I would say that this group really comforted me a lot, as well as helped me complete the film.
Pag pinag-uusapan nyo yun na, kasi I know I've observed it also na, syempre, given the news cycle, diba? There comes a time when it pababa na siya ng pababa sa attention, sa listahan ng things you draw attention to, because they say it's all the same. Pag pinag-uusapan na yun, how did you process this? Yung unti-unting paglagas ng tropa na tutok sa drug war?
For me, mahirap syempre i-sustain, to persist, for myself to continue filming like for 2.5 years. But I knew that I had an end goal in mind. And nung nawawala na yung international interest sa war against drugs, lalo na sa Pilipinas, ang daming nangyayari, hindi ako super affected kasi hindi naman ako nagbebenta ng photos. Alam mo yun, hindi gano'n nakatali yung work ko. I had a film, and then I was working in a different But for them, I think it was difficult. Kasi nga ang bilis ng news cycle sa atin, Pero I would say admirable lalo na sa ibang photojournalists and journalists na who really stayed and persisted uh, with this documentation even if they weren't earning anymore from it. So yeah.
I'm sure yung nakita ko yung dami ng foreign press who flew in and who did their own work about the drug war. And of course, they all had the best intentions. Pero, ba't ka natawa? Pero ano yung, what difference do you think it makes na ikaw yung nagkwento? Bilang, number one, bilang Pilipino, and number two, bilang babae. Ano yung kaibahan nito sa magagawa nila ng mga bisita?
Okay. First off, I have to say na I think super important yung mga films na ginawa nila. I think they are shown on a much bigger international platforms. And they are made for an international audience to understand what's happening here. And I think these films, they help our cause in bringing attention and the story out. So I think we need all the help we can get. So I think it was really nice that they did it. Pero being Filipino, I learned through these years na ang daming mga nuances and little things that you could only catch if you're local, if you understand the language, if you spend enough time. I learned a lot of things. I discovered a lot of things. I really started understanding how ingrained yung violence is, how it filters down to the youngest members of our society. So, in that sense, because of my understanding of how Filipinos are, I feel like I'm equipped to tell these stories to other Filipinos. So I think that's my that worked out for me. And I think I have to add, it's 4 years in and the war against drugs nawala na sa news, bumalik, ganun. And yung reaction sa film, ni-release namin last week, it made me realize how there's power in it. Even if it's old news per se, ano pa rin, people still feel it. So yeah.
Buti nabanggit mo yan kasi that's what I wanted to ask Nicole first. I saw the reactions to the film and many said that they couldn't even finish it. They only watched a few minutes and then they had to look away. And it even made me question myself because I watched it from beginning to end without a problem. Tapos naisip ko, ako ba yung damaged goods dito na bakit na-stomach ko siya and bakit yung iba hindi kinaya? Itong repulsion na naramdaman ng mga tao. In 2020, several years into the drug war, is this a good sign that we still have our moral compass intact? Or is this a bad sign which says we've been closing our eyes to this problem all along?
I think it's a good sign kasi ang opposite opposite niya na desensitize na lang yung mga tao, di ba? Na parang, okay, drug war na naman. Kaya ko yan panoorin. Pero as Alex already mentioned, parang the documentary is an invitation to really understand the stories. And I think it's really different when the invitation is coming from the position of empathy. Yung sundan natin yung kwento ng mga taong to na hindi lang siya basta 2 minutes nasa TV or pwede mo lang siyang scroll sa Twitter. Para sa akin, of course, at some points, kinailangan ko rin mag-pause, uminom ng tubig, docu-break, kumbaga. Parang hindi naman siya Love Diaz film na 9 hours. Pero parang dahil nasa field din ako, dahil ito rin yung topic ng research ko, parang I think yung power ng documentary is kahit parang gusto mo nang tumingin kasi hindi mo na kaya, meron ding part ng documentary na hinahata ka na kapit lang, tapusin mo yung kwento kahit alam natin yung ending nito na mas marami pang mamamatay. Pero I think yung power din nung documentary is that yun nga, nanggaling siya sa perspective ng isang bata na kaya siya bahagi ng kwento kasi yung katropa niya namatay. And I think that is really what causes discomfort for me in the film. Na yung kumbaga, the passive observers like ourselves na hindi naman directly affected, bahagi tayo ng isang, sabihin na natin, henerasyon na ito yung nag-define ng adulthood natin, na ito yung magde-define sa childhood ng bata katulad ni Jo Marie. Na parang if we think about this yun nga, sociologically, bawat generation, there's an event that defines how you see the world. So for example, like myself, millennials out there, sanay tayo na may isang family member na nag-OFW. That defines our generation. Kaya sanay tayo sa ganitong mundo ngayon. So napaisip ako dun sa kwento ni Jo Marie. Ito ba yung kwento ng generation niya? Ito yung kwento ng generation na lumalaki ngayon, na sanay na may nakikitang bangkay, yung generation na sanay na may narinig or na-experience na may katropang namatay. Ang ano nun ang tagal ng legacy nun sa lipunan, you really can't shake that off. So I think yun yung very powerful for me for sa film. It's not really the shock value because parang first 2 years siguro of the drug war may effect pa yung shock value. Pero I think yung emotion na nadadala ng film is discomfort. Yung parang ayoko na tumingin, pero sinasabi pa rin niya na wag, don't look the other way. Na focus on the story and we have to get through this together. So I think that's the powerful challenge, how we can unpack that discomfort and act on it.
What value do you think Alex being a woman, Alex being female, did it bring into the documentary?
Mahirap sabihin kasi parang on one hand, pwede mo rin naman sabihin na a storyteller is a storyteller. There's maybe not a distinct perspective. Pero I think mas nagmamatter yung isang identity na minention mo kanina, yung pagiging Pilipino. I think very resonant yon, especially sa konteksto nga ngayon na parang ang dami nating dapat ibang alalahanin, hindi lang naman drug war yung kwento dyan. Ang attention span ng mga audience very fleeting, tapos i-release siya sa panahon na nagpapanik tayo lahat dahil sa pandemic. Yung tapang na, teka lang, kapwa Pilipino, kailangan panoorin din natin to, hindi pa tapos yung laban. So for me, mas matingkad yung ganong identity claim na Pilipino yung gumawa. Kaysa mas may gender angle. But I don't know kay Alex kung anong take niyo doon.
Ikaw, Alex.
I don't really like to, I think it helps sometimes during the filming. Kasi if, yung logistics lang na if you're a woman, you have a small camera, mas hindi ka threatening, I guess. But for me, ito lang naman, I mean, my friends, the protagonist himself, Brother June, he's a very empathic person. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. I think you're right. Mas yung pagka-Pilipino nga. And yung idea lang ng pagiging empathic na tao matters more than if you were a man or a woman. Yeah.
May isa pa akong napansin tsaka na-appreciate dun sa film. It's the fact that you did not treat the CHR with kid gloves. Na syempre, nung sa drug war, yung mga alliances of people who still hope or people who still want to fight, napakaliit at lumiliit, di ba? Habang na-overwhelm tayo ng takot. And you would assume na baga aalagaan ninyo yung CHR na hindi, wag natin sila i-portray in a negative light in any way. But you did, and you were honest enough to show one particular instance na yung sa pananaw ninyo ay nagkulang yung CHR sa pagprotekta sa mga tao. Siguro, Alex, tanungin ko muna ikaw kung bakit mo dinecide na gano'n ang gawin. And then si Com Karen, kayo naman magkwento sa panig ng CHR na nung napanood nyo siguro, nung naalala ninyo yung pangyayari, ano yung naging processing nyo dun sa event na yun?
I think the CHR is really working against a lot of things right now sa administration na ito. Film is for sure aligned with what they are doing. It just so happens that in that instance, that was what was recorded. And so I think there was basically no other way to tell that story. That's actually probably my only explanation of why it was there. There was no other way to tell the story. It's not about, an expose or something. It was the honest way of telling what happened. And I think the CHR naman answered very admirably about what happened. So yeah.
Karen, kamusta po yung pagproseso ninyo dun sa event?
Well, first of all, no, we thank Alex for, it's not really an expose about CHR. It's more about exposing the ills that has happened in this campaign against criminality. I really don't want to call it a drug war because it shouldn't be. So I don't want to reinforce that idea. No? And then, of course, we always try to do our level best. What was recorded there is what is happening on the ground. So no matter how good your plans are, you cannot predict what will happen on the ground. And of course, hindsight is always 2020. We should have done this better. We should have coordinated better, etc. No? But to our defense din naman, we recognize those weaknesses in the field, but we also have to probably try to do a better job in explaining what the role of the Commission on Human Rights is. No? And many would say that our moniker is really a watchdog. But what does that really do? In the Constitution, perhaps we can be considered as a second check and balance democratic institution. That's one. Second is, in the Constitution, we are basically an investigative body. We monitor government compliance with international treaty obligations, and that's how we do it. But our investigations are not police investigations. And perhaps in that scene, and this is just my explanation because I don't know if this will be accepted, but this is my honest to goodness explanation for being perhaps from the perspective of someone who's been there for 27 years in the commission. No? And this is true for any national human rights institution. The expectation is so great and it overwhelms us, honestly. The expectation is so great, but reality on the ground says that we are limited by only this much power. And our investigations are human rights investigations. We do have visitorial powers over jails and detention facilities. Sure, we could have done a better job in that particular case. Some say that we could have actually filed a habeas corpus case or antimano, pwede ba naming i-haul out yung mga detainees? But there are processes to that. But what is important, and we have to take a look at it deeply, is the fact that there was a secret jail, it was uncovered. There was a denial by the state. And when we asked about the documentation, which is actually even violative of the PNP's own manual of operations, they couldn't show proper documentation. But after that, just to let you in on a timeline, no? 27 April namin ginawa yung surprise visit. May 10, we already filed in the Ombudsman. May 10, we already gave the PNP a copy of our recommendation, which is to file charges nga against these people, against the police officers involved. And what did the PNP do? The Internal Affairs Service, as a result of their parallel investigation, kasi sinabayan na nila kami nung pumutok na, no? They said that they don't find any probable cause to file criminal or administrative charges. But it's so obvious in the video that there should have been, because even the violation of manual of procedures would merit an administrative complaint. So, IAS yan. So, alam naman natin na ang IAS is not really independent operationally. But what happened after that is that the House of Representatives, through the Committee on Human Rights, and by virtue of pursuant to a resolution filed by then Kabayan Representative Harry Roque, actually conducted an investigation in aid of legislation. And their first recommendation was we endorse the complaint letter of CHR to the Ombudsman and to the PNP to investigate this case further and to file appropriate charges. When was that concluded? I believe that was concluded last January 29, 2019, 2 years after. Fast forward to today, we have exchanged comments already in the Ombudsman, but from day one, which is May 10, 2017, to this date, still under investigation when we monitor. So it actually brings you to, it invites you to take a look at the justice system as well. And it's not only just the carrying out of, let's say, operations, police operations, or the fact that when SOCO comes in and there's a death on the street, as very much well told, no, in this documentary. It's not just that. It's also about people's conditions inside detention facilities. It's perhaps the intention of kasi sabi nila dun sa secret detention cell, gatasan nila yan eh. Nakita naman natin dun sa dun sa pag-interview dun sa mga tao, no. So all these things, of course, it's not we accept our weaknesses, but we also beg the indulgence of the public that we also have limitations in terms of our power. We don't have prosecutorial powers as well. But those are not excuses. What we want to say is that there has to be solidarity, and I think kami naman, we're not impervious to, and we're not allergic to criticism, unlike other sectors of government. We accept that, and we have to move on together. We hold hands in frustration, but we have to move on because we have to continue telling these stories, and we have to inspire courage and not fear.
Ma'am, pagka nakikita ko sa social media, it seems the plan to discredit the CHR, to belittle your work, and to project you as useless noisemakers. It just on social media, it sounds sadly that they've succeeded in doing that. Parang almost automatic na kapag may mention of CHR, wala yan, pampagulo lang yan, ano bang alam niyan? Yung mga, and then the gaslighting starts. In the field, ma'am, ganun ba yung karanasan ninyo? Hindi na ba pinaniniwalaan talaga ang CHR ng mga pamilya, ng mga biktima, ng mga komunidad, and even in law enforcement, on the field, on the ground? Kamusta yung karanasan ninyo sa CHR?
Well, first and foremost, in past administrations, when we have these kinds of cases, we're not saying na ang EJK ngayon lang eh. We're not saying na ang impunity ngayon lang. But there is no encouragement from above. That's the difference. The accompanying language that emboldens violence, that says, good job. It's good that one time, big time, for instance. No, there was this time na on the average, when we plotted it, about 32 killings in one day in a span of several days. No, but in the High Commissioner's report on the Philippine human rights situation, it quoted a Supreme Court order because of all these questions on constitutionality nga of this the drug war. I'm putting it in quotes. Is up to 40, and then you hear the top officials saying, "Oh, if we can do this every day, this will be good." No? But accompanying that language is also the method of othering. No? Ano ba yung othering? Meaning to say na yung mga statements like, mga drug addicts, hindi na yan tao. Mga animal na yan. Ang mga kriminal na yan, ang daming ginawa, hindi yan makatao, hindi yan ano. Ang CHR, protector yan ng kriminal. All those are actually part of that narrative of othering. which is something that is also disturbing. Kasi kung natatanggap yan ng tao at maraming naniniwala dyan, doon tayo nahihirapan. In past administrations, it was not at all like that. There was cooperation with police officers also, with police stations. But what do we get? What we get are reports. We're being shown a memo saying, oh, you don't share information. No information. You tell them to go to the headquarters. And that pattern has been seen all across the country. And it's not even lack of cooperation. It's actually non-cooperation. Almost zero. So that's the environment that we are in right now. And I think what we have done to better ourselves is, of course, number one is to keep on keeping on. But we had to step up. So what we did was we reorganized. We did install a strategic communications team and to try to fight fakery and falsities with facts. Yun ang weapon na lang natin eh. And sabi nga there was one, and then of course the issue about troll armies, and they're very well organized. Ang sabi ni Bishop Pabilio in one rally, he said, if all of us speak, then no troll army can defeat us. So the first order of the day perhaps is to actually get that narrative back, the real narrative about how lives are being wasted in this campaign against criminality.
Grabe yun, Com, no? Yung halaga o yung impact ng basbas mula sa taas. Ramdam na ramdam niyo siya?
Sabi nga nila, no, ang sinabi nung unang spokesperson nga, you need creative imagination ba? To interpret what higher officials are saying, including the president, no? There's no room for imagination anymore. You say, oh, if we can kill as much every day, this would be good because it will eradicate all the drug users and all those involved in drugs. It's as if iisa lang ang mukha ng tao na involved sa drugs, no? Marami diyan. Ngayon, marami tayong nakikinig ng mga youth. Maraming instances na pwede tayong pagkamalan. Nakita na natin 'yan. At pagka ang order nandyan, tapos ang tingin nila na pag sinabi na, kahit walang basihan sa batas, pwede nang ipatupad, dun tayo nagkakaroon ng problema talaga. So it's we have to be able to siguro himayin kung ano yung natatanggap natin sa internet and all that, and try to convey what is really the right message, no?
Nicole, si Com was mentioning something about the effect on people's psyche. And I've also experienced this, I'm sure, of course, si Alex, na minsan kapag may kamag-anak kang napatay sa war on drugs, may mga kamag-anak pa na apologetic. And sinasabi nila na, di ba Alex, na oo kasi addict talaga yan eh. And then tatahimik na lang sila as if it makes complete sense to them that their loved ones deserve to die. Ito ba, itinuro ba sa atin? Kinondisyon ba tayo na mag-isip ng ganito? O dati na ba natin tong dala sa isipan natin at ngayon lang lumalabas na ang taong may ginawang masama deserves the worst possible punishment?
Oh, marami actually explanations. Yung mga kasama ko sa research team, actually yung angle na kinukuha nila religious eh. Some actually not theologians, but pastors would even justify that this is the Old Testament at work, di ba? Yung revenge and punishment. So on one hand, pwede nating sabihin na nasa kultura rin natin yun. Pero para sa akin, Shara, yung pinaka-challenging dito is that, yun nga, alam natin na malito, alam natin na may karapatang pantao, alam natin yung values natin bilang tao. Pero pag ako rin, nag-i-interview din ako katulad nyo ng mga pamilya na yun nga, umaamin na, oo nga kasi pasaway talaga yan eh. Or kahit yung mga nanay na pag tinanong namin, ano pong masasabi niyo dun sa panukala na ibaba yung age of criminal liability, tapos sasabihin nila, actually okay sa akin yun kasi yung anak ko natatakot ako baka sumali na sa gang. Doon feeling ko nagkakaroon ng gap yung pag-uusap natin from us who have clear commitments on human rights versus the lived experience of parents who really feel helpless. Diba? So parang feeling ko hindi naman sa sobrang ingrained na dahil ganito tayo, dahil Pilipino tayo, masunurin talaga tayo, tinatanggap na lang natin lahat ng sinasabi ng mga mas makakapangyarihan. Sa tingin ko hindi yun eh. Sa tingin ko yung challenge, wala pa tayong lengguwahe na magbe-bridge nung mga aspirations natin of having a society that believes and upholds human rights dun sa anxieties na nararanasan ng mga nanay, ng mga pamilya dun sa ground. So I think this is really a work in progress. And that's why I'm such a fan of stories. Kasi ang stories, pwede mong sabihin na kahit ano man yung politika mo, kahit ano yung paniniwala mo, mag-a-agree tayo sa isang bagay. Tao to. Tao to na may kwento, hindi lang siya addict, di ba? Tatay din siya, kaibigan din siya. Yung pagiging addict niya, hindi lang ito yung kwento ng buhay niya. Marami pang aspeto yung pagkatao niya. And I think this is one way of bridging that conversation na kahit nagkasala tong taong to, may iba pa siyang kwento na gustong sabihin. So I think that's the space in which we can all work around.
Do you, kayong nag-field work pa rin on this, the government's war on drugs, ganun pa rin ba ang sentimiento ng communities? O meron na ba kayong nararamdaman na shift or resistance na, sandali, parang hindi na to tama? I mean, may mga sub-characters ka, Alex, sa film na kinakitaan mo na nung resistance na yun, na parang brewing. Yung kausap ni Brother June dun sa may gate, di ba? Na parang sasabog na siya sa galit at lungkot. May nagbabago na ba sa mga komunidad?
Meron. Sorry, go ahead, Alex.
I noticed in some communities na mas na-inform. So but usually they're like families of victims. And then, yung neighbors din nila, pag nararamdaman nila na malapit sa kanila, may nangyari, may namatayan, ganun, mas definitely nagbabago isip or, malapit na sa ganun. Pero strangely enough, marami pa rin sobrang supportive because they think na, yung the very, nung nag-transform na from the previous administration to President Duterte, nawala daw lahat ng mga addict. So hindi na ito yun yung main narrative nila na hindi na nakakatakot maglakad sa kalye. Pero it's not really usually mga people from these communities that say that. So I'm not sure.
Nicole, how do we make sense of that? Yun nga, ang karamihan sa mga namamatay, and this question has been asked many times before, pero parang wala pa ring sagot na bakit ganon na kung sino yung sektor na sila yung laging namamatayan at napapatay, sila pa rin yung supportive of the method of cleaning the streets. Are we missing something here?
I think kasi yung evil genius ng Duterte regime is that ang galing-galing nilang pagsabungin yung mamamayan. Yung instead na tayo yung magdadamayan, may namatay, ang galing nilang maghiwalay ng neighborhoods and ng communities. 'Di ba? Na parang ang logic ng tukhang ay sumbungan. 'Di ba? Na isumbong mo yung kapitbahay mo na malagay sa listahan. Ngayon, they're relying on the chismosas to report on COVID, 'di ba? So I think kaya rin yun yung lasting legacy ng administration na to na sa halip na magkaroon ng solidarity yung mga communities na pare-parehas din namang apektado ng drug war, na everyone is at equal risk na pagbintangan na addict. Pero mahirap makita yung logic ng cooperation in these communities kasi ang logic talaga ng Tokhang is to fragment communities, to pit people against each other, and for us to turn against each other. Kaya rin siguro mahirap maintindihan kung bakit may namatayan kang kapitbahay, hindi ka makikiramay, hindi ka pupunta sa burol. Kasi natatakot ka na baka pagkamalan kang addict din, di ba? So parang grabe yung effect ng ganitong klaseng policy. sa pang-araw-araw na buhay ng mga tao na kahit hindi na siya political question, kahit tanong na lang siya ng kagandahang asal, pag may namatay makiramay ka, even that was ruptured by the logic of this administration.
Miss Shara, are you there? Nawala po sa connection si Miss Shara. We will be contacting her lang po. Let's wait a bit for Miss Shara Zambrano.
Grabe yung chismosa for COVID.
So, yun ang ating health policy, chismisan portion.
I just learned na canceled na ulit ang flights overseas. Ay,
Ngayon lang.
ngayon lang, we're all stuck.
No, kami din, canceled lahat dito din.
Just on that, siguro yung Nicole, yung experience no, on the ground. Of course, sa ground zero, kasi the movie was really ground zero eh. Na halos araw-araw may pinapatay. No? Pero when we did a survey on the death penalty and we asked about experience of people, why you want the death penalty, etc. When we cross-tabulated some of the responses, most of them are not basing it on experience because hardly have they ever had experience on heinous crimes or being accused of a heinous crime, no? But what actually came out somewhat is the fact that they get all these, they're anxious. That word is proper to use, no? Anxious sila, they're worried. Pero where does that worry? And when we asked another question, where do you get all these ideas, your news about forming your opinion? And the number one medium is television. So if we're going to actually convey messages, ang number one medium dapat in our analysis is really television. Internet is fast rising, pero ang television talaga will has the influence, a great influence in trying to form the opinions of people. And that's a nationwide survey. But in this case, I don't think naman it would be fair to say na yung mga bumoto kay presidente ay yun ang mga nasasalanta. Kasi marami din naman ang hindi bumoto. Pero marami din naman ang nag-change ng mind when the cases hit close to home. In their neighborhoods, and then that climate of fear is really something that's really there, no? Just to share with you that more than 90%, at one point it was almost 98%, if I recall correctly, all the cases that we investigated on EJK were actually motu proprio cases, meaning that we investigated on our own. We didn't wait for people to complain. And that is perhaps an indication of how fearful people are. And then just to add also, there was one in the chat box asking where are the Rahaba 12, yung 12 na nandun na nakadetain. No? We were only able to trace about 2 people who remained on bail, who remained in the facility, no, for a longer period of time. But out of the 12, one already passed away due to tuberculosis after being released, and then 9 of them are actually on bail. Pero I think we only got 2 people to reach them because all of them just moved places already. And that's really understandable.
Alright. Kakabalik lang ni Miss Shara. So, hey po. Okay.
Sorry.
I was gonna, before siguro we move forward, I was gonna ask si Alfonso, now that we've been talking about storytelling and narratives, what do you think is the importance of seeing these narratives and sharing these narratives to the youth and mainstream media? Nakamute ka po.
Okay. Just to bounce off the ideas that were brought up earlier by the other panelists, I do agree that there is indeed a narrative war, and we see it even in the language that's being deployed by this administration and how they define the kind of predicaments that we're in, such as the war on drugs, so to speak, or the war against COVID, or the war against communism, and things like that. And I think the use of war metaphors itself is indicative of the very divisive narrative building that this administration is trying to carve. And so I think that a central feature, an integral feature of that particular narrative is how it dehumanizes its enemies, how it identifies its detractors, for example, as senseless, noisy people, how it identifies drug users as mindless zombies, how it identifies communists as nothing but troublemakers with no ideological, merit to what they're doing, and things like that. I think that all of this dehumanization needs to be countered with a kind of radical empathy that I think is intrinsic in a lot of artistic labor. I think primarily because art, no matter what the medium is or no matter what the genre, tends to lean on storytelling as its primary strength. Whenever whether it's in the films, and we don't really have to go far because when we're talking about portraying these narratives and restoring humanity into people, we don't even have to fictionalize. We don't even have to render narratives as new narratives as though they're disparate from the reality that's actually happening on the ground. As you can see in Aswang, for example, I think one of the great things that I saw in the film was that it and unlike the recent documentaries that we've seen, and I do agree that there's merit to those documentary films as well. Aswang did not feature any big personalities. There weren't any big name politicians whose narratives were the focal point of the film. It focused on the stories of the people that government has been reducing into senseless beings, and I think that that's important because it does remind people that those that are being talked about in these particular narratives are indeed people, and that it restores some sense of humanity, and it sort of radicalizes some sense of empathy. And I think those are crucial in order for us to also wage this war against the narrative that's being propagated by the government.
May tanong ako kay Alfonso. Lalo na nung when the whole ABS-CBN problem started, or when the ABS-CBN shit hit the fan, nagkakaroon ng pagbabangga yung mga iba't ibang klaseng artist. There are artists who are calling the government out, who are vocal about injustice. Meron namang mga artists who are saying, hindi namin trip yan eh. Delikado kaya, may COVID kaya, don't impose your values onto me. So nagkakaroon ng isa pang layer of conversation in art, wherein there are some people who honestly believe that art should be used as a force for change, and there are others who believe it can just be a fun thing, and it doesn't have to be, deep and heavy and used as an activist tool. Ikaw ba? Anong views mo dyan bilang isang batang artist?
I feel like this sort of takes us back to this age-old debate on art for art's sake, on whether art can be on whether all forms of art or all artistic products are necessarily political. And I think the answer is very easily yes, although it's certainly more complicated than that. Meaning, I think that art is primarily a platform, so it, I guess, matters what sort of realities and what sort of narratives you privilege, what sort of realities you shed a spotlight on. And so I think art is political not only based on what it chooses to say, but also based on what it chooses to omit. And so I think that if artists choose to, for example, privilege mundane things like heartache over social realities, over social consciousness, or if artists privilege aesthetic value over social consciousness, I think there is a political statement in that particular choice itself, and I think that's very problematic because we always have to ask ourselves the question, especially now when there is indeed a demand for art to always be political or for art to be to some extent political. And I do see that, I think, especially coming from the independent scene, where people demand a certain sense of social consciousness from the works of artists. I think it can be a double-edged sword because on the one end, you do want artists to steer the conversation and use their medium and use their platform in order to shed light on these particular realities. At the same time, you don't want them to exploit these realities in order to create some veneer of political awareness that I guess fuels only their artistic labor. And so I guess I've resigned to the idea that maybe while we shouldn't overvalorize art as though it alone can change the world, we also shouldn't overburden it as though its primary responsibility is indeed to save the world. And so I think where I'm getting at with this particular point is that always ask yourself the question as an artist, who is your work really in service of? And whose stories, whose narratives are you privileging using your medium, using your artistic labor? And so I guess the bigger point then becomes the role of the artist obviously transcends beyond the page or transcends beyond the limitations of the screen or the canvas. The role of the artist will always be to participate in the larger political discourse that happens outside your artistic practice. Meaning, you're not just, I mean, it's great, it's fantastic that you get to write sappy little poems about heartache, but at the same time, we'd want you to take it to the streets. We'd want you to organize. We'd want you to mobilize and express solidarity with actual communities that you're writing about. Because otherwise, we're merely thrusting these artists into the realm, into the sphere of prestige, without actually disrupting the systems that exclude the communities that are being featured in these narratives from actual material survival. And we need to bridge that gap all the time. We need to make sure that you're not just creating art because there's a good story that you can tell beautifully, but you're creating art because it has actual merit, it has actual value in impacting material change in the lives of the people that it talks about.
At saka sa panahon ngayon, napapansin ko na it's the silence of the people you're waiting for. Yun yung mas naririnig mo, yun yung mas nararamdaman mo. Why isn't he talking? Why isn't she speaking? Where is she? Where are they? So the silence itself, your choice to not speak, is your voice.
Well, yeah, it's a statement in itself. I think the silence is a statement in itself. Mm-hmm. And I think that has to be interrogated, especially when we operate in a somewhat capitalist system wherein influencers, for example, privilege their capacity to earn over their participation in the larger political discourse. I think that has to be questioned. And I think the reason why a lot of this is being sort of unpacked and critically exhausted right now is because we see a lot of injustices happening simultaneously, not just with the global health crisis we're dealing with right now and the kind of government incompetence that it's being that that's it, that matches it. But at the same time, we have the anti-terrorism law, we have the shutdown of ABS-CBN, and then we have films like Aswang reminding us that problems like the extrajudicial killings during the since 2016 is still something that we're dealing with, and something that we haven't fully confronted judiciously yet. So I think it's just a lot of things, and so I think people are demanding solidarity now more than ever.
Nabanggit mo na lahat ng all the other ingredients in this messy cocktail wherein there is the EJK, there is the anti-terror law, there is the government response to COVID, there is the ABS-CBN closure. For some people, it feels and it seems like too much to bear. And I want to ask Nicole, what do we say to people who feel this way, which is very valid, diba? Once you get on Facebook, pick your problem, and all of these problems are overwhelming in their own right. Pero and I felt this personally. Syempre, I'm from ABS-CBN, and then I was reminded by Alex's documentary na, nga pala, EJK. So parang I felt in my heart, oh my goodness, how much more can we take? Is valid naman yun, di ba? To feel that this is too much. But then it also drives some people to just give up and drop their phones, drop everything, and just focus on fun things and not think about it anymore. Nicole?
Totoo yan. Tsaka parang, syempre I agree with everything that Alfonso said. Pero parang kung uunawain din natin kung bakit may mga taong ayaw magsalita ngayon. Kasi speaking of has a cost, di ba? Kung magsasalita ka, sikat kang artista, pwede kang siraan, gawan ng kwento, i-troll ng todo-todo, maglabas ng fake na sex tape. Bakit hindi? Ginawa nila yan kay Senator De Lima, right? So fair game. Kahit sinong opposition person, artista na high profile, fair target. Kaya, I mean, ewan ko, baka popstar lang talaga ako. Pero naiintindihan ko rin talaga na hindi madaling magsalita sa panahon na to at naiintindihan ko kung bakit may takot yung maraming tao. I think lahat naman tayo, ako, text ako ng parents ko na, tama na, may anti-terror na, baka ipa-deport ka nila sa Pilipinas or something. And it's exactly these grievances that are legitimate that I think we also need to properly process. Kasi we also don't want to alienate potential allies. So that, to me, is my take as a sociologist. Pero as a citizen, sobrang iba rin yung pananaw ko doon. Kasi bilang mamamayan, para sa akin, nag-agree talaga ako sa sinasabi ni Angel Locsin, di ba? Anong pinoprotektahan mo? Wala ka ng career, di ba? Or kahit man hindi yung political aspect. Sabihin na natin, this is not a discussion of politics, but this is a discussion of good manners. Meron kang Chanel bag dahil nag-invest yung network sa'yo at hindi napunta yung pay raise mo sa mga cameramen at crew sa paligid mo na nawalan ng trabaho ngayon. Hindi ba magandang asa lang na sumama ka sa kanila, makiramay, to stand, not even in solidarity, if solidarity is such a political word, but to be a good human being. I don't think that's such a big ask. Kaya rin feeling ko, dito sa usapin na bakit ang hirap magsalita, bakit ang hirap maging political, maybe the emphasis should not be on politics if politics is so divisive. Maybe we need a different language. Maybe we can use the language of care or language of compassion, di ba? Na these are terms that may not be politically loaded, but these are terms that unite us as people. So, I don't know, parang medyo I'm fence-sitting on this. Of course, I really want to hold this regime accountable. Of course, I don't like what's happening in this country. But yung thinking ko is, I think, going to the direction of what about people who made a deliberate decision to think that speaking up has costs. People who think that, hindi ako kasing tapang nila, I accept that, it's a character flaw. How do we take them on board? And I think that conversation has to continue. We don't need to alienate these people. We have to bring them with us.
And how do we process these simultaneous problems that are weighing down on us? Dapat bang tingnan natin sila as interconnected problems with just a single source para hindi nakakapagod? Or is it even accurate to connect people who died under EJK versus yung real fear natin ngayon na nararamdaman sa anti-terror law. This fear of speaking out, whether nasa barangay, kapitbahay ka ng o bayado ka ng ABS-CBN, are the connections that I see in my mind real? And should we maybe to bring these minds together, should we somehow kumbaga parang fuse all of these problems, these narratives into one? Or baka hindi naman, baka that's kumbaga stretching masyado?
Well, yung perspective ko when it comes to this is really to celebrate what people can do given their capacities. Of course, it would be nice to have this grand movement that connects all of these struggles. Pero ang skepticism ko lang doon, sino yung gumagawa ng kwento? If we create this big group, again, may mga hierarchies din na lumalabas dyan. May mga boses na mas malakas din sa iba. So my thinking about this at the moment, and obviously nagbabago-bago din siya every day, is why don't we celebrate moments where people find their voice and get inspiration from that moment? Nung mga Kathniel fans, biglang nag-We Block Us One. These are non-political fans, di ba, na hindi naman nakikialam masyado sa mga Duterte issues. Pero nung tinatalo na yung mga fans nila, biglang political, biglang anti-troll. Some people would dismiss that, na ano ba yan, mga teenagers, walang magawa, TikTok lang ng TikTok. But I think there is value to listening to these kinds of parang medyo fragmented, medyo subtle, medyo everyday, medyo mundane, hindi naman niya malulutas lahat ng problema ng Pilipinas. But I think there's something to celebrate in these fragmented ways of protesting and getting inspiration and energy from these protests. So I guess I like the point that we have to connect all of these struggles. I like the point about how it's important as a nation to have a definitive statement of what we want in this particular time. Pero wag din sana tayong mapangunahan ng yabang na pag may mga nagpo-protesta na hindi naman typically political, wala yan, may mga Kathniel fans lang yan. I think there's so much value in that.
Alex, bilang kwentista, paano natin pipiliin kung saan natin itututok yung lente natin ngayon?
Gumawa ako ng decision early on. At alam ko kung kanino ko gusto ipanood yung pelikula. In fact, ang exact thoughts ko that time was OFWs. Kasi I wanted to tell a story na mas magre-resonate from our old stories, from stories that we knew as children. So yun. And so that's also why the film was made this way. I wasn't out to convince people who already thought the same way as me. Meron akong plano and meron akong intention that it could really touch hearts. It could at least open a conversation sa mga ibang tao na makapanood. Like, I was always thinking na kapag nandun ako sa field, iniisip ko na if these people were beside me, pag nakikita nila yung nakikita ko, naririnig o nararamdaman ko, maintindihan nila kung bakit ganito yung opinions ko, yung stand ko. So, ayun. I think we just have to use whatever platform we have, cinema or text or even music like Sinabalakid, like, I really like what Nicole said na dapat mas maging inclusive tayo, especially towards people na iba ang opinion sa atin. We can't shut down people na sabihin natin tanga yan, ganun. Hindi dapat, I think hindi dapat ganun, even though I feel that way many times. So yun.
Pero saan tayo, I'm throwing this question to anyone who has an answer, because I've asked myself this question many times. I haven't, I have no answers. Saan tayo magsisimula na makipag-usap sa mga nasa labas ng mga echo chamber natin? Di ba? Nakakasawa, yun ba ang salita? na kapag kausap mo ay yung mga people who have the same thoughts as you, nawawala yung value niya. Kasi pag nagbukas ka ng Facebook, there's that whole other echo chamber working that irritates you and repels you enough to just move away from them. Whether someone did this deliberately or whether this is an organic development in our society, it's there. And how do we break these walls? Paano tayo mag-uusap uli kung ganito nakalalim yung divide na nakikita natin? Yes, Alfonso.
I think this is why art is particularly important, because I think it's perceived to be neutral ground. It's not by default seen as political. And even if you go back to the martial law era, for example, when with films by Lino Broca and Ishmael Bernal, smuggling political messages, I think it's how a lot of people in a politically oppressive situation in which free speech was censored by a lot, tried to get their messages across. And I think that that's something that we can do still today, with films that don't have to be as as explicit in its message as Aswang, for example. And I think that's how we got to Katniel fans, for example, because I don't think that those people were necessarily part of the echo chamber that we usually operate in. I feel like they were merely coaxed into those conversations by political pressures being experienced by the people that they were supporting, for example, or and I think, of course, those people that they're supporting, Catherine Bernardo and Daniel Padilla, for example, are products as well of their artistic labor. And so I think art is very integral because, once again, one of its central features is indeed storytelling, and we want to be able to tell these stories as much as we can. And if you ever have any chance at being able to replicate these conversations outside of our echo chambers, and stand a chance at convincing a family member or two that maybe supporting this person or supporting this government may not have been the right thing to do, we have to start in places where they feel like they can be heard, where they feel like they're not being, like what Nicole said, not being alienated, not being othered in a way, not being perceived as senseless beings themselves. So I think, art, I think, is can be a starting point.
Alex.
Can I also add to that? Kasi isa sa mga comments that we got when we released this film for 35 hours, I got a lot of complaints about, bakit nandito lang sa internet? Bakit nandito lang sa echo chambers natin? Ba't ninyo ilagay sa Netflix? Ganon. So, for me, putting it on Netflix won't put it out of won't bring it out of our echo chamber. It just makes it more accessible to all the rest of us. Sige. Pero yun, we do have plans and strategies of how to bring something like this film, to communities who don't have internet or naka-cellphone lang, ganun. Like these little plans and actions are in place. And I think yun nga, to make it more available, it's a lot of risk for a lot of people, especially the people in the film. So ayun, parang it's just a little more imagination of how you can distribute your films. Hindi na siya the same way as before. I'm talking about films. It's not the same way as before na sine na lang or ganun. Para makarating sa mga communities talaga. Ayun, it takes a bit more imagination, and I can imagine it should be the same way for other medium.
Yes, Nicole.
Yes, quickly lang. So, ako medyo old school. So, yung isa sa research projects na ginawa namin is to convene deliberative forums, or tawagin na lang nating forums, who will bring people together coming from different perspectives. So, yung experiment namin dito is isang barangay in Quezon City na ang daming na tokhang. And the community is divided between those who support tokhang and the tokhang families. So we got a random selection of these people, put them in the same room. Nung nagsimula yung forum, feeling ko face-to-face to. Tama ba? Yung kay Chang Ami, na parang, my God, kailangan namin ng bouncer. Kasi talagang may mga nag-ano na, kita tayo sa labas mamaya, ganyan. Pero yung framing namin ng forum is, lahat kayo dito magulang. At ang topic ng conversation natin ay paano natin may enhance yung security sa barangay ninyo, lalo na sa mga anak ninyo. So buong araw yon, nasa Ateneo kami, may picture taking, may ang daming chance for the neighbors to get to know each other. Yung ending, they all were able to come up with a proposal on how their barangay can better respond to community issues, particularly of security and drugs. Pero yung pinaka-touching sa akin is that nag-iiyakan kami pagkatapos ng forum. Kasi yung mga natokhang na families, ang sinabi nila dun sa mga kapitbahay nila, sorry, adik yung asawa ko. Siguro kung minahal ko lang siya ng mas grabe, hindi siguro siya magbebenta ng drugs. And then yung mga DDS dun sa event, sabi, alam mo, kaya niya nagawang magbenta ng drugs kasi mahal na mahal niya kayo. So huwag mong sisihin yung sarili mo. So talagang iyakan portion talaga. And it took one day to get that conversation going. It took one day to create a forum where people had the opportunity to reflect and basically get out of their echo chamber. I don't know how we can scale this up on a national level. I don't know how we can do more of these forums. As I mentioned, this is a research project. But I guess the message I want to say is there's proof of concept. I mean, they do this in post-conflict societies na yung mga taong nagbabarilan, militar at mga rebel groups, they put them in the same forum and they realize that there's more that binds us together than what separates us. So yeah, I think there's also opportunity to explore the more old school barangay assembly type of conversations. Kasi iba rin yung pag nakikita mo yung tao kaharap mo, nag-iiyakan kayo together, nagsisigawan kayo together. I think that changes the quality of the conversation also.
Yes, Karen.
Yeah. Well, I ditto to everybody, no. It really boils down to actually confronting what we are faced with right now, and it's really a division. It's misunderstanding. It's not in sync. So I think again, language plays a very very vital role. There were comments on the chat box saying, kasi we're alienating naman the DDS, masyado tayong high and mighty, we always preach, yung ganon, no? So, I think the mode that Nicole shared with us is something worth replicating. We did that to a certain extent. We do community-based dialogues, and we normally do this with security sector. But of course, amongst members of the community, we can always replicate that. No? So allow me lang just to probably say, maybe Nicole, we can talk about that. I'll ask our people to get in touch with you. I'll be in touch with you also, because the conversation must keep on going. No? And then there's better understanding. So going back to language, sabi nga namin when we were starting our strategic communications, no, human rights was given a bad name. Paano na yan? So sabi namin, what's common among all people? It's dignity. Dignidad ng lahat. So let's do it that way. If right now, human rights as a concept has been given such a bad rap, then let's try to use a language, a universal language that is acceptable to both sides or to all the sides. No? And I think that's what's most important here. That we bridge. We don't contribute to the division. So always being open, and part of that, of course, is trying to understand the milieu, the perspective of the other side. No? And then less of talking to each other, probably targeting those who are undecided or those who are hardcore against what we are actually espousing. So it's all about that, and we just have to hold hands and try to do it. engage them without alienating them.
Should we all just get off Facebook then? Because that's often where all of the hate and vitriol emanates and is exchanged. Siguro, yun yung, and not everyone has the capability to do the work that you, Karen and Nicole, are able to do. But they all have Facebook, and the other side is there, talking to them, throwing hate. Sa mga taong yun, sa nakararami, saan sila pwedeng magsimula? At ito yung may mga tao na may galit na sa puso at may takot na pwedeng nawalan siya ng trabaho, nawalan siya ng kamag-anak, o natatakot siya na baka ako na yung sunod. Paano natin sila tutulungan na anong kailangan nilang gawin?
Well, for us, no, whenever we on our Facebook page, talagang open season. What we do is we don't engage them directly. We don't confront them to say, "Ay, mali ka," etc. What we do is try to post something that would correct the impression and to try to invite attention to it. And all these are facts, no? We can always keep on doing that. Pero, syempre, dapat mag-open up din yung kabila about it. Try to find something common in that conversation, no? In that thread. Kasi, katulad nga nung sinabi natin bakit ganon? When we reflect, and that's a good word to actually use in this forum, no? When we try to reflect, bakit kaya ganun tayo? Bakit ganito ba ang Pilipino? Bakit parang nag-a-upload pa sila na may namamatay? Hindi pa naman yan dumadaan sa justice system. So it's all about reflection on our end. Are we doing a good job trying to translate this into a language that they can actually understand? But for me, my interpretation of all these rants, all these vitriol, is actually also a cry for justice. Kasi that's why we're missing the point. Because justice has not been there. There is impunity. It has just become acute because of all this approval, encouragement, and all that. But impunity has always been there, and there are a lot of human rights violations that have not been solved. So all these cries, all this away in Facebook is also a cry for justice. Meaning na naparusahan ba yung dapat maparusahan? And if we go back to our history, ang dami-daming mga violations na hindi talaga na nakuha yung karampatang parusa, no? Doon sa violations na yon. So a lot of this has to do with what has been happening in the past, and we must be able to correct that. Sabi nga nila, ito na ba yung culture natin? But culture is not static. We can always change that, albeit very slowly, but at least we just have to keep on keeping on, no? And try to engage and be inclusive as much as possible, and not come out as a high and mighty institution to say, mali yan, mali ito. Let's look for solutions also that they can probably adapt. Kasi sabi nga nila, puro naman tayo reklamo. Anong solution mo? Anong suggestion mo? So dapat constructive rin.
Well, SONA is coming up. So I want to ask this important question that has something to do with our life, our safety. Protest is valid. Protest is necessary. But COVID is there, and it can kill, and you can cause, you can endanger the life of someone, a protester beside you, if you go out into the street and raise your fist. But if you stay home and no one talks and everyone just hides, the injustices continue. So how do we navigate this world that we're in? Siguro, tutok tayo sa pagprotesta. ito ba ay mali sa panahon ng COVID? O meron bang paraan na magawa ito ng ligtas para sa mga gusto na talagang pumunta ng kalsada at sumigaw?
I'll answer that first. Siguro no? Well, first and foremost, we have to follow health protocols. Kasi kaligtasan din natin yun no? But there are other platforms where we can express ourselves. It's not only in the streets because napakahirap din nga ngayon. And that's going to be on the 27th of July. What we normally do pagka may big events na ganito, we're invited by the police to just coordinate and see what their actions are going to be. And of course, we're in between. Civil society also asks us to please monitor the rallies and all that. No? But there are other platforms. Hindi lahat makakalabas. Diba? Hindi lahat makakalabas, pero meron tayong iba't ibang platforms na pwede. Facebook, Twitter, and all that. No? Pwede rin namang we can just hang something in our gates if we cannot get out. No? There are a lot of ways of doing that. And we must be able to siguro express ourselves well where we are. And that's the most important thing. Right now, it's really, really, really very extremely difficult because of COVID. We want to protect ourselves, our families, and also others. No? So my guide is first and foremost, follow the protocol. Because lalo na if you decide to go out, the first thing that you can encounter is probably a police officer telling you to wear your mask or keep your distance and all that. No, that's the first order of the day lang muna for me. But you know.
So kung gusto mong lumabas ko sa SONA, gusto mong maglakad sa may batasan, do you think it's still justified to do it at this point in time?
Well, that's legitimate dissent naman if you want to express yourself, no? And it has been a tradition that groups will assemble around Congress to be able to express themselves, no? But at this point in time, because of the pandemic, it's very hard to do that because of the health protocols as well. But it's legitimate dissent. It's also freedom of expression. It's also freedom of assembly. So long as we follow the guidelines on health protocols and also not destroying public property, for instance. Yung mga ganon, I think the police assigned to the area will have cause to arrest you if you go out there. No? But it's still on the 27th. We don't know what guidelines this administration will issue between now and then. So let's see. But the CHR will be there to monitor the demonstrations, definitely.
What about you, Nicole? Does the need to stay safe and keep each other safe supersede the need to voice out against the many injustices that we are experiencing?
So I think I will take lessons from what happened here in Australia. Malaki rin yung protest dito habang may COVID following the Black Lives Matter. And it was possible. They studied kung kumalat yung COVID dahil sa protest. They found out na hindi naman kumalat sa protesters because staying outdoors is actually safer than staying indoors. So there's a value there as long as you practice social distancing. If I can actually make a wish, sana yung mga police na magbabantay ng SONA, sana ang iniisip din nila safety for health, na sa halip na magdala sila ng mga panakit sa tao, sana mamigay sila ng face mask, sana mamigay sila ng hand sanitizer. For once, protektahan naman sana nila ang mamamayang Pilipino, di ba? So I think for people who want to protest, as long as, sabi nga ni Commissioner, as long as they do it responsibly, as long as social distancing is enforced, then I think it's important. Kasi turning point tong pandemic na to turning point siya when it comes to dissent. Kasi ang daling i-dismiss ng dissent by saying, may emergency may pandemya huwag nyo na gawin yung dissent na yan. slippery slope yan eh. Sinasanay tayo na parati na lang may emergency, parati na lang tayo nasa gera, parati na lang may martial law, di ba? Kung sa Mindanao man yan or ibang bahagi ng bansa na emergency eh, wag muna yan. Wag tayo masasanay na ganun. So I think as long as the protest is conducted, in a responsible manner, na hindi naman naaalanganin yung mga kasama natin sa bahay, especially the vulnerable, then that's okay. But I think the last point I just want to emphasize is maybe we can also explore alternative ways of physically protesting. So yung ibang suggestions na naririnig ko from my peers here in Australia is, what if lumabas na lang tayo sa bahay natin parang New Year, yung nagpapaputok sabay-sabay yung mga kapitbahay, bakit hindi tayo lumabas sabay-sabay at mag-noise barrage, nagkakakitaan pa rin tayo so we still feel like we're physically connected even if we're distanced. Noise barrage, I think, is a powerful way of doing it, because I think some of the most successful protests in the world right now are protests that allow people to do something where they are, where they can, and where it's fun. It's fun because it's life-affirming. So I think the bottom line here is that what we are protesting is the very thing that kills us, which is government incompetence, which is an assault to our human rights. These are things that kill us. It's not just the pandemic that kills us, but it's how this government is responding to the pandemic. So by being together, we're standing up for life. It's not putting us necessarily at risk if we do it correctly.
Alfonso, yours. You wanted to say something kanina?
I'd just like to echo what Nicole said, that that the government has indeed sort of weaponized this the precarious situation that we're in right now. And because of the global health crisis, the people are less likely to march on the streets and exhaust their grievances. And I think this is also kind of why they've been taking advantage of like the situation with like the double whammy of the anti-terrorism law being officially taking effect 8 days after the largest network was shut down, and with talks of charter change being back on the table and things like that. And I think this is why I agree that we can participate in protests, but we should practice it responsibly, and make sure that we put premium to to our safety and security and all that, and agree as well that we should explore other mediums in order to exhaust our grievances that allow us to be able to do it within the safety of our own homes. And at the same time, I think the bigger point that we should all try to make with all of these efforts, micro efforts happening in our own houses, for example, or on the streets, is that we cannot yield to this government intimidation, to this intimidation by institutional forces that are trying to undermine our fundamental rights, that are trying to take advantage of our precarious global health crisis in order to accommodate their self-vested interests. And I think this is why we need to put social pressure on these institutional forces by protesting any way we can, no matter whether we're on the streets or we're at home. The point is to let them know that that there's dissatisfaction, that there is in fact rage and anger. So
meron akong tanong na para sa inyong lahat, and gusto kong simulan kay Alex. Yung hashtag nitong forum natin. Yung tema natin is huwag matakot magtanong. Huwag matakot magsalita. Ikaw na nakita mo na yung aswang ay pumapatay. Ikaw na nakita mo na nakakasira ng komunidad, ng pamilya, yung aswang na nagpapakita kung gusto niyang manakot at nagtatago kung gusto niyang mawala sa paningin. Bakit hindi dapat matakot sa maraming aswang na pumapalibot sa atin ngayon?
Wala na tayong choice at this point. Nasa tipping point na ata tayo na if we don't move, if we don't take action, tayo ang sasalo ng future na to. Atin to eh. Yung mga most supporters ng president mas older din naman. So, ayun. Kung concerned tayo at kung gusto natin na maayos, na meron tayong chance as a people, then we have to take action now. I have never felt as angry, as helpless at the same time as I have at this point in our history. And I agree that we all have to protest. I agree with the fact na reaffirming siya. Nagawa naman, nakapag-protest naman tayo nung Independence Day, I think, safely against the anti-terror law. At the same time, online protests work as well. I know that we have certain concerns, including yung mga sabinang pinapalipad nila all over us. Itong ganitong ano. So, maybe kailangan rin natin mag-spread ng information on how to do this, on how to keep ourselves safe. Madaling sabihin na wag tayo matakot, ano, pero maybe kailangan natin mag-plan as well, as a group, as a collective, to do it safely, not putting anyone at risk.
Alfonso, bakit hindi dapat matakot ngayon?
For me, it's not really that we shouldn't be afraid. I think there is value to that fear, and fear is a valid reaction. But we also need to process fear as a feeling. And I think that by unpacking and critically exhausting that feeling, we understand that there is an enemy that's causing that feeling. Like recently, my parents, by the way, who voted for Duterte, and I think to some extent still support him, phoned me and told me that I should lay low on my social media and not exhaust my grievances so much against the government because of the anti-terror law. And I think the bigger point that they were trying to get to is that they were somewhat acknowledging that there is something wrong when the fact that my opinions and my musings on social media can put me to risk. And so I think that's like one way of processing that fear, because the fear that we all feel is perfectly valid. I think there is real reason to be afraid, and we need to, I think, react to it proactively. Meaning, yes, I agree we should protest, and I think if in an ideal world, I would, invite everyone who's watching to be taking it to the streets and exhausting their grievances outside Batasan. But then, we're not living in that world. So I guess process the fear, try to unpack the fear, and try to sort of replicate whatever insights you gather from that critical exhaustion and bring it to conversations outside your echo chamber. Tell people why you're not the only one who should be afraid, why we should all be afraid, and why we should act in accordance to that fear.
Karen, dapat ba kaming matakot? Natatakot ka rin ba?
Siyempre, lahat naman matatakot, di ba? Pero the point is, tama si Alfonso, we have to realize, why are we fearful? Why are we afraid? But we also have to overcome that fear if we want change to happen, if we want a better tomorrow to happen. And I'm just reminded of the fact na siguro alam niyo yung bystander effect, na nag-aantayan, hindi tutulong kasi meron namang iba. Siguro yun ang dapat nating i-overcome. And then be creative in expressing ourselves, no? Be responsible, but not only responsible, but be creative also in trying to overcome your fear so that you can express yourself better and conveying that message better, no? Siguro ang kailangan lang nating sabihin, hindi ito tama. Yun lang, di ba? Hindi ito tama. Tama ba na pumatay ng tao? Tama ba na ang resulta ng mga drug operations ng police humahantong din sa pagkapatay ng tao? Hindi ba dapat serve and protect? Yung mga ganong klaseng messages. Of course, there are rants that you hear. Siyempre, minsan hindi natin mapigilan ang sarili natin. But I think this time around, we should be more creative. We should have self-control, but be more creative in our criticism. So that somehow we can convey that message. And that main message is, ano bang tama, ano ba ang mali? And that's the basis for our calling out.
Nicole, natatakot ka ba? Dapat bang matakot?
Yeah, I think I agree with Alfonso na i-recognize natin kung saan nanggagaling yung fear, di ba? Na ang daling ma-hack ng account, ang daling makahanap ng picture na kinahihiya mo, it's so easy to take people down right now. So let's embrace that fear. Madaling hindi matakot kung wala kang inaalalang pamilya na kailangan mong pakainin bukas, di ba? So in a way, courage can also be a sign of privilege na, okay, I'm ready to give everything away because I'm not afraid. So, yun yung una kong message. But I think especially now in the year 2020, to not be afraid also means to be ready to offer an alternative. Yung hindi tayo matatakot kasi handa rin tayo. Alam din natin yung gusto nating mangyari. So, in a few months, usapang election na to eh. In a few months, eto na naman, sisisihin na naman yung mga bobo na botante na parating lang bumoboto ng dynasty. Pero nakakalimutan natin, ano bang choice nila? Wala naman silang choice. So now I think is the perfect time, not just to conquer our fears, but to also offer what we want, di ba? Na parang alam natin kung ano yung hindi natin gusto, anong gusto natin, di ba? So I think now is the time for us to start that conversation. Now is the time to basically organize and potentially support leaders that can organize a machinery that can beat dynasties everywhere that have been oppressing a lot of communities, not just during this regime, but even before that, mayors, governors who have been acting like warlords. It's part of Philippine politics, but there is power, I think, now once we start organizing. So yes, I'm afraid. I think there are good reasons to be afraid, but I think our fear will be conquered if we have an alternative to offer.
Alex, naisip ko yung Aswang nung nangyayari na yung unti-unting pagsara ng ABS-CBN. Kasi parang inisip ko sarili ko, para siyang isa pang form ng tukhang. Yung nagigising ako isang araw, yung katabi ko wala na. Ginagawa ko yung trabaho ko, biglang meron akong kaopisinang lalabas sa isang kwarto na umiiyak. At yung iiling na lang at sinasabing wala na. It feels a lot like death. Yung loss of people who you know are good and are just gone by the thousands. It feels a lot like they are being killed. But then I also think back to when I was a kid. Nung panakot din sa akin yung Aswang, Manananggal, Tiyanak, White Lady, at lahat ng lumalabas sa Magandang Gabi Bayan Halloween Special. all the fantastic characters of Philippine folklore na itinapon sa ating mga kabataan just so we won't go out. And I think back, how did I address that as a kid? Lumabas lang kami ng mga kaibigan ko, hawak-hawak, para hindi maligaw kasi madilim, and nagdala kami ng flashlight at tinutok yung ilaw sa mga puno na lumalangit-ngit, dun sa malalaking shadows na sinasabi lang yun yung kapre. And we found nothing. But we found our courage, and we realized na yung mga figures na yun wala. There was just one person who was trying to scare us. And I don't know how that will affect my movements in the coming days and months. Pero siguro, I'd like to close this discussion with something one of my mentors in ABS-CBN shared with me when I started covering conflict. Kapag hindi ka na natatakot, matakot ka na. Kapag hindi ka na naiiyak, maiyak ka na. Kapag wala ka ng awa, nakakaawa ka na. So, I guess yun din yung sinasabi din yung lahat. Our feelings are valid. But we don't have to be paralyzed by them. Alamin natin kung saan ito nanggagaling. At alamin natin din kung ano yung gusto nating Pilipinas na makita sa mga susunod na araw. So I guess that ends our post-screening discussion of aswang, and many other things. We wish you all the best. Maraming salamat sa inyong lahat for staying, for asking your questions, for just keeping your thoughts with us. Nakikita namin siya na lumalabas-labas lang. And it informs our discussions. Whatever method of dissent, whatever method of expression you are comfortable with, sinabi na ng mga experts natin, go with that. If you're not ready to go all out, okay lang. But just don't stop and don't hide. Be courageous because, as Alex said, we have no other choice. This is the only country we have. This is the only time we have. So maraming salamat, kita-kits sa Facebook, sa lansangan, sa iba pang screening ng Aswang. Good luck to all of us. Thank you, thank you. And let's turn it over back to Krishna of Activista to close the show.
All right. So thank you, Miss Shara. Thank you po, Direk Alex, Alfonso, Dr. Nicole, Commissioner Karen. Thank you so much, everyone, especially sa panelists and moderator natin for giving their time, their hearts, and their knowledge sa discussion natin ngayon. Thank you for sharing your passion also. Nakita natin no na even sa chat box, sabi nga namin, ito yung pinaka-alive na chat box na nakita natin. I'm not sure if everybody's been monitoring, but along with the conversations dito on screen, may mga running conversations rin on the chat box nagsasagutan. So thank you so much. We are creating spaces for ourselves wherever we can. Nakikita natin rin dito. And also, sa Mentimeter, if we can also flash yung Mentimeter kasi early on pa lang, a few minutes into the pagbigay ng link, naka 57 na ata na messages sa ating Freedom Wall. So, while we wait for the screen to flash for the Mentimeter, I would like to thank also everyone who are here, our organizers, our participants and attendees. Thank you so much for actively listening and actively participating. And I would also like to, as a part of Activista, thank you so much kasi ito rin yung pinaglalaban natin, yung radical empathy, yung pag-change ng narrative into something hopeful, something that we can build on. I agree po na kahit huwag matakot yung banner message natin dito, it is important to feel scared. It is important to feel all these emotions because it is what makes us human. And the rehumanization is important, especially in times where binobombard na tayo ng lahat for us to be desensitized. So and yun, I really like yung last na story ni Miss Shara na kapag natatakot kayo, you just all hold hands and face your fears. So courage is contagious, and nakikita ko sa lahat ng nandito and sa lahat ng mga participants natin that we are willing to hold each other's hands and to fight, to continue fighting because wala na rin tayong choice, and that is what makes us human nga. So thank you so much po. I would like also to invite once again, we will be ending the live stream in a bit, and I would also like to invite again yung mga participants natin to magpaiwan dito sa discussion natin because we will still be talking about our youth actions leading up to SONA. So salamat ulit sa lahat, and God bless. Thank you everyone. Good luck sa ating mga endeavors, and kita-kits tayo sa lansangan, sa Facebook at sa kung saan man. Padayon po.
Hello to all the attendees that stayed. Thank you for joining us. If you don't want to stay, kasi we'll change you into panelists para we